We're talking with Jeff Smulyan. Jeff is an entrepreneur. He's a radio guy. That's the only reason I let him in here. And his book, Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down. And the subtitle is The Ups, Downs, and Reinvention of the Entrepreneur. I think it should be called Radio, a Love Story, because this is really about you loving something and getting into it and out of it and doing great, then doing not so great. Inventing a bunch of stuff, not in the world of technical stuff, but among other things, you really invented sports talk radio as we know it.
It was not particularly beloved when I did it. It was kind of, it was called Smulyan's Folly. Jim Lampley called it the Vietnam War of Emmis. And I have two chapters in the book. One is called, I have a favorite saying, Tom. The line between being a genius and an idiot is very fine, and I've been on both sides. So one chapter is Idiot to Genius, the birth of sports radio, because when we did it, we had a managers meeting, and it got voted down. And one of my best friends, Steve Crane, said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "You can't lead where people won't follow. We're not going to do it." And the next day, Rick Cummings, who you know, came into my office with Doyle Rose, and they said, "Look, we still think it's a stupid idea, but we owe you one. The company's doing really well, so we'll do it. As long as we don't have to be involved in it." They didn't really want to be involved. And we put it on the air, and it was a disaster.
For a while.
And it was losing record amounts of money. And then about a year and a half later, it started to take off. We also bought the NBC stations and switched frequencies. We inherited Don Imus, who at the time had been in and out of rehab 4 or 5 times. And I'll never forget when we were buying the NBC stations, I met with Don's agent, and we were talking about, will we bring Don over? And I said, well, let me see if I get this right. We have a radio station which is losing record amounts of money. It carries the New York Mets, who now have more drug problems than anybody in Major League Baseball, and a guy who has been in and out of rehab for the last 5 years. What could possibly go wrong putting this thing together? But it came together. As you know, Don spent the rest of his life with no problems, and it worked. And so I became a genius.
And we're getting kind of ahead of the story because I want to sort of start at the beginning. But you talk about this and the fact that after that station took off, you noticed when you were traveling around the country, every city you'd go to had a sports talk full-time station, including they usually stole your slogan.
They would all. Well,
the power and the fan.
That's a big thing in the radio business. If something works somewhere, you'll see it on billboards everywhere else. At least when the industry used to have billboards.
But we're kind of getting ahead of the game. That's when you had a lot of backers and things were going great. When you started, you grew up in Indianapolis, went to North Central. And you always wanted to be in radio, but somehow you ended up in law school at USC after graduating. But you ended up back in Indianapolis. And you started with, I'll be delicate here, kind of a crappy AM.
Well, it wasn't quite good enough to be crappy, but it was in that genre.
And one of the interesting stories you have is that one of the guys you hired was a offbeat weatherman named Dave Letterman.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's funny. The backstory is I always wanted to be in radio. I was going to get a master's in telecom. Everybody said, if you want to be an entrepreneur, go to law school. In those days, everybody said go to law school. To date, 100 people out of 100 say get an MBA. I always said if I had gotten an MBA, I would have understood the concept of risk and never would have been an entrepreneur. But my dad talked me into coming back home. He had a cousin who had a small daytime station that was not doing well. And he said, come back, and while you're waiting to start your company, run this thing. And we hired David. David was our midday guy. And David was just David. And the problem, I learned more about programming to the available audience because a daytime talk station really reaches people 65 and older. And we were a bunch of 25-year-old guys. And I had a lot of friends who were my age who listened to David, who thought he was great, but these 65-year-olds just thought this guy's from another planet.
And when Dave signed on, as I understand it, he said, I'll do this for 1 year, then I'm going to L.A. to become a writer.
Absolutely right.
And he, of course, went to L.A., ended up at the Comedy Store. The
rest is history. But it was fun. And, I mean, I've told a story. One day I came back from lunch, and an irate listener called me and said, you got a communist working for you. And I said, well, when you say communist, what do you mean? He said, well, Letterman. He said, I called Letterman and said, there are communists in Carmel. And do you know what he said? I said, I don't know what he said. He said, you got to give them Carmel. He said, the roads are always...
Carmel is considered to be the fancier suburb of Indianapolis.
Fancier suburb of Indianapolis. And until that call, I'd never known there were communists in Carmel. But this listener knew that there were communists in Carmel, supposedly. And David said, you got to give them Carmel. The football team's lousy, the roads are torn up, and you can never find a good parking space. So hold the line at the next suburb, but give them Carmel. But David did stuff like that.
And what's kind of interesting then is, obviously the money was flowing the wrong direction.
Yep.
And as I recall from the book, you ended up turning it into a religious station,
right,
because you were able to sell the time to make enough money.
Yep.
But that's what got you started in radio, even though you weren't particularly interested in religious broadcasting.
No, I was not. And as a matter of fact, at the time I was kind of bored, and I wrote a book called The Emmis Region, which is the Hebrew word for truth. I never published it, but it sort of kept me busy, and then it gave me the chance to name my company Emmis, which is the Hebrew word for truth.
Where was the money coming from when it was losing money in the beginning? What were you doing?
Well, we were losing money, and my dad was an investor and some other people. And fortunately, once it switched to religion, it wasn't losing that much money because the station wasn't that big. And when it switched to religion, it started making money. We actually bought a second station from Bob Gibson, the Hall of Fame pitcher in Omaha, did religion there. But that was sort of as I was getting ready to start the company. And
kind of interesting, because then you end up owning a baseball team years later. And there's a bunch of great stories in the book about your excursion into baseball, where you became kind of a pariah, and learned about how unfun it is to be well known, and every day open the paper and, oh, look, everyone hates me.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I said the chapter after Idiot to Genius is Genius to Idiot, because when I went to Seattle, we were kind of the marketing wizards, and baseball was looking at us, and we sort of were a good counterpart to the previous owner who wasn't loved, and I gave speeches all over. One of my dear friends from here was at the ballpark one night, and we were going to get a bite after the game, and he had to wait 20 minutes for me to sign autographs. And he said, any society that wants your autograph is a society that's in deep trouble. But it was fun, and we were, sort of the boy wonder in Seattle. And then we just said, this is losing too much money, and we put it for sale. And it was then I became, a bum. My favorite story about being a bum, in the earlier days in Seattle, I would walk around the ballpark, and one night I was in right field, and the fans stood up and cheered, and Jay Buhner was our right fielder after the game, said, I'm busting my rear end every night, running into walls, and nobody does anything. You make one appearance in right field, and they cheer. And then after I became a pariah, I ran into Jay, and he said, I don't see you walking around right field anymore.
Yeah.
But my favorite story was people were generally nice. One day I was at the ballpark, and a guy yelled up to me and said, get out of our town. This is our town. Get out of Seattle, Smulyan. And honest to God, the guy was wearing a Red Sox uniform. So only in Seattle, a guy wearing a Red Sox uniform. But that was Seattle.
Yeah, there's a great story, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. The most surprising thing to me about many of the, let's call them deals you get involved with.
Yep.
The most surprising thing to me is how often you're doing everything right, and there's some bizarre behind-the-scenes quirk that queers the deal. Most, and I'll get to it in a minute. The Los Angeles Dodgers acquisition. You should own that team, but because of a very weird, unexpected twist, you don't. But I want to get kind of start at the beginning a little bit, because you are an entrepreneur. But as I said, I would have subtitled the book "My Love for Radio." Because at the time, and I want to put a date on it, it's late 70s, early 80s. You ended up getting what they call a stick. An FM station that was located in kind of the outskirts or the exurbs of Indianapolis, moving it closer to town, getting the licensing all done. What's interesting about that is you say that it took forever to do, and sort of similarly to down the road with the Los Angeles Dodgers situation, one guy almost queered the deal. That you said you had no idea it would be that difficult to do this simple maneuver. Can you tell me the...
Well, I think that in those days, in the Wild West days of radio, and I never knew this and still don't know, but I think competitors kind of said, let me get to this agency and block this. We saw it in Minneapolis, where when we bought Minneapolis, all of the stations, the FM stations, couldn't get on the big towers because the big stations wouldn't let them. So they moved everything to downtown Minneapolis, where they built the IDS Center, and they got blocked anyway. So there was a lot of that Wild West. So I think our situation with our first tower was there may be some regulators who knows, but it got blocked for a long time, and only because we won the lawsuit. It took us 2 years to get the darn.
But then the significance of it is this was a station that really had no presence in the bigger city.
Right.
But once you were able to move the antenna, which there's a bunch of great stories about it, but that's when you were able to start billing more money because you created a format that wasn't here.
Right, and you could reach more people. There was a station, it was a station in Shelbyville, Indiana, which is about 25 miles from Indianapolis, and the antenna was just on the building. It was like 50 feet. So the reach of the station in FM and TV, it's all height. So when we were going to build a 700-foot tower 10 miles close to Indianapolis, it could reach the whole metropolitan area. So instead of reaching 50,000 people, it could reach 2 million with a better height.
But also, you created an interesting format, and I actually remember you guys came up with, and I think you came up with it, a brilliant commercial that parodied what was then the present sort of structure of the radio station. You had the one old timer that everybody loved in the AM, and then you mocked the two stoners that were running the thing. And I could remember one of the lines, something, "I'm playing golf with the governor tomorrow." But the commercial was a smash.
It was,
and your station went way up.
Way up. It was funny because Rick Cummings and I have been together since day one.
Rick is a programmer.
Rick was the head of the programming on the first day, and we've been together all these years since. And we sat down and we wanted to create a TV commercial. So it was marketing 101. What are our strengths? Our strength is FM music. In those days, most of the music was on AM. We had the fidelity of FM. And since we had no commercials, we were playing a lot of music. And since we had no money, we couldn't have high-priced personalities. We couldn't have contests. We didn't have a lot of billboards. So we satirized all that. And at the time in Indianapolis, was a guy named Gary Todd, wonderful guy. But Gary had become almost a caricature of himself, because when you listen to Gary, he had been on the air for 20 years and he knew everybody. And you always, so the line was, "Tomorrow I'm playing golf with the governor." Well, if you listen to Gary, he was always name dropping. And we satirized that. We satirized Q95, which, we satirized WNAP. We satirized the country station. And it was a smash. And the tagline was, "We let our music do the talking. We're not talking at you." And I'll never forget one of my favorite moments of my life. I'm in a line at a movie theater, and the people in front of me are saying, "Have you seen that commercial? It's the greatest commercial of all time, and we love that station." And there are times in your life where everything hits, where it's just, as you know.
It was a great spot. I remember one of the lines was they were mocking the sort of talky kind of morning show that I do, and one of the guys goes, "I was so wasted last night."
Yeah, we were making fun of WNAP.
But that was great. But and there's without getting too inside radio, you mentioned in your book that you guys kind of came in and killed WNAP, which eventually, years later, you would own.
Right.
And there's a conversation with Rick Cummings go, "Well, we killed it, and now we can't bring it back
Never
to life."
brought it back. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we laughed about it because IBC and NAP owned the market then. And then we came in, and then you guys came in and really took over about everything. We got a few breadcrumbs. But NAP had just fallen, and it was dead for a long time.
Now, and I know a little bit about some of the aspects of the business as radio, but this may not surprise you. I know almost nothing. So reading your book, I learned a lot about where you guys are up here, owning and moving and all that stuff. Where was the money at this point? You had some initial investors, and then in the book you talk about you had some very complicated contracts.
Right.
So when you moved to the first big FM here, then you guys start acquiring big time, and then eventually go public. What's the money structure going?
Well, what's interesting is that the original investment was about $250,000. My original investors, Mickey and Bob, put in 85. I put in 70. I got some sweat equity as well. And then we had a note with the original people in Shelbyville. And in those days, and this is true of any business, when a business is growing, you can borrow money against it. It's called leverage. And as I talk about in the book, when leverage is your friend, you can make an awful lot of money very
And
quickly.
eventually, leverage becomes kind of a shit show for you.
When things turn south, it is the ultimate shit show, Tom. And I talk about that. So we really employed leverage. Nobody put any more money in that business for the first 8 or 9 years. Because what happened is you buy a station with no cash flow, you get $1 million of cash flow, and you could lever that up to borrow, in those days, $8, $9, $10 million, and it just built upon itself. So by the time we struck it rich with Los Angeles, we bought Indianapolis and Minneapolis, and then St. Louis and Los Angeles, and we bought out our partners, and we found Wall Street. And then we bought, the Doubleday stations and the NBC stations, and really it was just all done. We took in some investors. Dave Letterman came in, and a few other people when we bought out our original partners. But other than that, we need to put more equity in.
So, are you getting paid a decent salary in these early days?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have great needs. I don't know what they paid me, but I was paid a nice wage.
But a lot of that money isn't yours. Right? I mean, a lot of the money to build this operation is other people.
Yeah, although really what it was debt, because if you really look at the only equity that we put in for 8 or 9 years, it was $85,000 from each of the 2 outside partners and $70,000 from me, some of which came from winnings on a game show, believe it or not.
Was it the dating game?
No, I wish. No. It was Gambit. Las Vegas Gambit.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, and so then it was just basically reinvesting the profits into new businesses and leverage against the profits. I don't want to get too technical, but that was...
And you also have to give yourself a little more credit than you do here. It wasn't like you walked into Los Angeles and bought a station that was perfect and functioning.
No.
You guys went in there and really, really developed something brand new.
Right.
You go into some detail about the demographics of L.A.
Yep.
It involves a specific aspect of the Hispanic population,
Right.
a specific aspect of the African American population, a certain type of music. You guys walked in there, figured it out, and exploded that station.
It absolutely. When we first bought the station, it was adult contemporary. We left it that way. We brought in Robert.
And that
W.
means
Morgan.
like the Carpenters and soft
the
rock.
Carpenters, soft rock, Neil Diamond, stuff like that in those days. That didn't work for a year, and we switched it to something we always thought about, and it was then rhythmic top 40. Today it evolved into hip hop. And we put it on the air, and I will never forget it. It just exploded. I talked about in the book that radio was such an integral part of people's lives that when I was in college at USC, you couldn't go to a street corner and put your windows down and not hear KHJ. And then, 15 years later, the same thing. You put your windows down an intersection, you heard Power 106.
To go way back again, when you started, did you ever go on the air?
I went on the air a little bit. I was a fill-in talk show host for David Letterman. True.
Are there any tapes?
No. I think we burned them a long time ago. And then Cummings and I would do a sports talk show on weekends. And
Rick Cummings, the programmer.
More fun. This was at the first radio station. And I've always loved it. I always loved being on the air. I always said when you're in management and you go on the air, nobody can bother you, whatever the problems are. You're just on the air. I always loved it. Never did it, but in another life, I probably would have done that and not been in management.
What's interesting to me is you are indeed an entrepreneur, and you get into a bunch of stuff that is not all radio, including there's some tremendous chapters about getting involved in a European radio situation.
Yep.
Which is going great, and then without giving too much away, you get completely screwed by a government problem. But also you end up being an ambassador. With all of your experience in business, all of a sudden you're working in the political realm. Can you give me the short version of that story?
The short version is I met Bill Clinton, and we had mutual friends. And just
you met him early on.
Early on, before he ran for president. And just thought he was one of the smartest, most engaging people I've ever met. We were supposed to have breakfast for an hour, and we spent 3.5 hours talking. So I helped him a bit in his campaign, did some fundraisers for him. And when he got elected, they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Look, it was after baseball. I'm absolutely going to rebuild Emmis. Emmis had problems in that era, and so that's my focus." And they came back and said, well, how about a part-time thing? You can be a U.S. ambassador in charge of the U.S. delegation to the International Telecommunications Union.
And this is actually turns out to be some pretty big stuff.
Yeah, big stuff. Not sure how they picked me. I always said I had less technical expertise than anybody who ever lived. But I was in charge of a delegation of 50 people to the conference. It was a 7-week conference. And they said, all you have to do is do that for 7 weeks. And before that, for a year, you have to meet with your delegation once a week. So I'd fly to Washington, and then I did like 4 or 5 bilateral meetings around the world. And I enjoyed it. I loved my delegation, and ended up with the most bizarre thing where during the conference, they came to us and said the Arab states want to get some technical assistance for the Palestinians. And they're willing to recognize Israel if the United States will broker this. And you have to remember, it's hard to believe all these years later that was happening, but it was after the Oslo Accords. And it looked like we were on an inalterable path to peace. Today we're miles away from that. But it was one of the most fascinating things I've ever done, because I'm in there meeting with not only some Arab states would meet others. I'd met with the representative of the PLO. I would meet with Israel. I'd go back and forth. Everybody, the Israelis certainly knew I was Jewish, and the Arabs certainly knew I was Jewish. And it really forced me to bend over backwards to understand, especially the Palestinian side. And we ended up with an agreement. I was very, very proud of it. Certainly the most fascinating thing I've ever done.
I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
Again, you're just this guy from North Central High School with a handful of friends, not a lot of money in the beginning.
Yeah.
And you're doing this?
Well,
you meet the president, and I think you're selling yourself a little short.
Well, I will tell you a great story. So one day, and you know me, my relationship with almost everybody is just kidding, needling around all the time. So one day I wake up and I'm watching the news, and the President of the United States is in a press conference, and he's saying that, well, Saddam Hussein has massed again on the Kuwaiti border. The United States will not allow an invasion of Kuwait. Okay, wonderful statement by the president. I walk downstairs. The woman who was a Kuwaiti ambassador comes up to me and said, Mr. Ambassador, I have to know will your country stand behind us? And I said, yes, absolutely. The President of the United States has given assurances. Now, she walks away thinking, this man's been on the phone with Bill Clinton all night working this out. Not that this guy...
Not that you saw it in the hotel room on the TV.
Right. And one of my State Department people came up and said, thank God you were watching CNN this morning and said the Cartoon Network like you usually do, or you never would have known this. But I mean, I loved it. It was fun. I made some great friends. And it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. For the most part, everybody in your book that you talk about, even those that you had a really strong disagreement with, or you always kind of give their point of view. A couple times you say, this guy was actually, now that I look back, he had a different agenda. I get it now.
Right.
You're very kind to most of the people, which I think is really nice. But there are a lot of aspects of this. I had no idea that you did all this cool stuff. You end up in television. So this is really a lot of stuff about being an entrepreneur. And occasionally, I should have had a yellow pen when I read it. You will sort of give a little, like a couple of words of wisdom. You'll tell a story, then you'll go, well, I learned this. Not always flattering, but really valuable. If you're, I mean, obviously I'm a radio guy, but if you were in any business, I think you can read this and you're going to learn a lot about failure.
Absolutely.
And about success, and you're really honest about both.
Yeah, I've always said, whenever I go speak to college kids, I say, go out in the world and be prepared to fail, because that's when you learn the great lessons of life. I've also said I'm an entrepreneur because I'm not hireable in a free society. So
I remember one funny line you said, if I'm getting this right, you said something like, well, I went to law school, and my lawyers tell me that if I'd ever become a lawyer, I'd be impoverished and homeless.
Yeah, well, I think, I said I went on inactive status in the State Bar of Indiana 40 years ago. I think the answer is, if I practiced law, they would disbar me within the first week.
Even better. I want to talk, again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's really interesting to me how many of these large deals, you'll put months and months and months into these things, and you've got a great staff, and you trust them, and you do. But I want to talk about the Los Angeles Dodgers situation. You owned the Seattle baseball team, and for a lot of reasons. It wasn't the right market. They have problems as a city. It wasn't a baseball town. I think it's much more interesting when you decide you're going to get back into baseball. You have an opportunity to buy the Dodgers.
Yeah.
And it's a great story. Then in the end, the whole deal goes away because of a personal issue that you had no idea was going on.
Well, it is a fascinating story, and the book talks about some of the things that we didn't do. You know, when I got out of baseball, David Stern was very kind to me, and he offered me the Houston Rockets, and David sort of ran the NBA lock, stock, and barrel, and I turned him down because I said I have to rebuild Emmis. My friend Jerry Reinsdorf said that is the single stupidest business decision in the history of America. I've said, I think it was second to Microsoft, or so IBM's decision not to do software, but it was right up there.
Right.
But we looked at other things. We looked at the Dodgers, and we were fascinated. But at the time, the Dodgers were losing $50 million a year when Fox owned them. So it was a big loser. We were a public company, and we said, boy, it's really going to be hard to take even though we felt we could turn it around pretty quickly, which was the right assessment. Because Fox, it was just like a stepchild for Fox. But we said, look, we have 16 TV stations. They have 7 TV stations in smaller markets for them that we would love. Cleveland and I think Memphis and Kansas City and Portland, whatever. And we said this would be a great combination. And I knew the people at Fox. And I said, look, we can buy the Dodgers, but we got to pair it with the 7 TV stations, because if not, as a public company, if it's $1 billion deal with the 7 TV stations, everybody go, okay, yeah, fine. And so we talked about it. Everybody seemed to love the idea. We were fortunate. The people in baseball sort of liked us and always wanted us to get back in the game. So we were kind of the favored people. And what happened was, and I didn't know, and it's in the book, I didn't learn till later, there was sort of a Murdoch family problem where Lachlan, who was running the business, the son, decided he didn't want to give up any of his territory. So at the last minute, he said, I'm killing this deal. And at the time, there was a big family dispute between other heirs. And, you learn all this later. And so they couldn't do it. And I was just with my friend, Tony Bensequera, who's one of my favorite people. And the day before the deal, he called me and says, is there any way you'll do this? I said, Tony, you got another buyer? He said, we really don't love this buyer. And I said, look, we can't. We cannot buy a baseball team for $350 million. That's losing $50 million a public company. Our stock will go to zero. So we couldn't do it. Obviously, the franchise was sold 7 years later for $2 billion. So another one of my egregious mistakes.
Yeah, but as I recall the story, you guys had a really great bid in there.
Yeah.
And the reason it didn't get accepted is because Rupert Murdoch and his son, Rupert didn't want his son to pay them even more because they weren't getting along.
Yeah, I mean,
and you had no way of knowing that.
No, we had no, and really, when you say a great bid, baseball said, this is the value, this is the deal. So as long as you met that number, you were fine if you were the preferred bidder. We had a situation where we were the preferred bidder.
Did you ever have nightmares thinking about that's so much money.
Yeah.
And you're a guy that started with $70K, half of it borrowed, and now you're talking about $350 million a couple dozen years down the road.
It's funny. I mean, I have a favorite saying. If any one of 10 things that happened, my company would be 1,000 times bigger. And if any one of 10 other things that happened, I'd be sweeping streets somewhere. So my life's been pretty darn good. Should I have been more economically successful? Yes. I probably could have never had as much fun as I've had, and we've certainly done well enough that economically, it's been great. So, you just do the things you love, and sometimes it works and it's great. Sometimes it doesn't work, and you do the next thing.
There's another story where you chose to go on a family vacation, and looking back, you realized if you hadn't gone on that vacation, you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me because you'd be living in your island in Hawaii.
Well, my valet's valet would be here today.
Yes, okay.
No, seriously, Tom. It was another crazy story. I was reading a story about the bidding for the Minnesota Vikings, and Carl Pohlad, who owned the Twins, is a good friend. And I was talking to my friend Bill Schweitzer, who was baseball's lawyer, is a dear friend who's since passed away. And I said, you know what Carl ought to do? Carl ought to buy the Vikings. Because there's a massive stadium problem in Minneapolis. They both played in the Metrodome. It was bad. I said, then if he owns the Vikings and the Twins, you meet with the government and you just solve the stadium problem. And he said, it's a great idea. Well, next call he's on was Bud Selig. Tells Bud that, and Bud said, that's a great idea. And then Bud calls Carl Pohlad. So Carl calls me and said, if you'll do this, you're in. And Carl was an incredibly wealthy man and said, look, you put in what you want, but you got to run the process and do it and put in what you want, and we'll take a run at it. Now, you never know if you're going to win a bid like that. But there, a couple bidders, and certainly when Carl Pohlad came to the table, I mean, and we probably could have helped a bit. And what happened was the bid was like 2 weeks later, and we had to do all this work, and it was right in the middle of a trip. I was taking my kids to Israel and then to Hungary because we owned the network in Hungary, and we were going there, and then we were going to London. And it was a family trip, and Gary Kasich, who was my dear friend, who was president of the Mariners, was taking his family to a trip. And we said, God, I don't know. Do we blow up these family trips and blow them up and do them later and spend all our time bidding on the Vikings? And we didn't, in retrospect, and I love my family, but they probably could have waited a month for that trip.
And they'd probably love owning a chunk of the Vikings.
Yeah, well, the Vikings, I mean, again, today, but that's life. And listen, you never know if you're going to get it, but we certainly would have been a very, very viable bidder.
Like I said, there are a lot of great lessons in the book, because you talk about some of the stuff that didn't work,
Yeah.
and a lot of the stuff that did. And it's not just about radio, it's about television, it's about baseball. I thought it was fascinating, and I did not know this aspect of it. You mentioned that you got involved with a foreign country,
Yeah.
setting up this incredible radio
Right.
network.
Right.
And the lesson you learned is, at the whim of any
Yeah.
government official, all of a sudden, all your money, you're out.
Well, it's very timely today because today there's a story, Secretary of State Blinken
Right.
is in a battle with Hungary. And the guy who he's in a battle with and who all the European Union is in a battle with is the same guy. So I'll tell you the story. We bid after the ambassador thing, we realized we got to know a lot of people. And it was after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is now in 94, 95, 96. And they were all setting up to privatize media. And everybody patterned it after the U.S., the FCC. Well, when you're investing capital, you want sort of make sure there's a rule of law and there's a regulatory system you can live with. And the Hungarians, were certainly doing that. And they set up a national bid for 2 major radio networks that were all around the country. We bid, we won one of them. It became a smashing success. So much so it was called Schlager Radio.
Which means?
Hit radio. And it was a wonderful success. As a matter of fact, when we were doing the research for it, we did research and it came back and the people said they really wanted hits of the 60s and the 70s, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, and I said, how could this be? This music was banned. Go back and do more research. Came back and said, of course it was banned. That's why they loved it, because they heard it. It was smuggled in. And it, you think the Beatles and the Stones mean a lot to you. It meant a lot more to people because it represented freedom in the West. So we put the thing on the air. It was a smash success. We had it for 12 years. It was in a country of 9 million people, it probably had 4.5 million listeners a week. I can still remember meeting with the Prime Minister in Washington one day, and he said, I listen to your morning guys every day.
Hilarious.
Everybody loved Schlager. So
let me interrupt for a second. Programming-wise,
Yep.
was it similar? I mean, did you have the 2 guys talking back and forth?
Yep.
Were they doing bits and
Yeah,
jokes and
doing
making fun
bits,
of?
and I can still remember one of the bits. They had a guy flying an airplane upside down under the main bridge that separates Buda and Pest, and they did. I mean, it was a great morning show, and they were fabulous.
So very kind of American in its sensibility.
Very American, and it was funny because we would have battles with the regulators over, can you do this, do not, because it was a new regulatory regime, but it was all patterned after the FCC. So if you do your job, which we always did,
you get to keep your license.
Keep your license. So all of a sudden, and in retrospect, what happened was, right at one point, our managers called us and said, we got the strangest call from the socialists. Now, you have to know that in those days, the socialists are running the country, but...
Or NPR.
Yeah, that's
Joke.
Yeah.
Kidding.
Or Bernie Sanders. No, but the socialists were running the country, and they had run the country for a while. And Fidesz, which is sort of the right-wing party, was going to take over the country. The socialists had some scandal. The prime minister had like a 30% preference. So Fidesz was starting to take over the country even before the elections. And we got a call, and the socialists said, look, you're going to have to give us half your license or you're going to lose it. And our people said, this is this is crazy. We've got, the biggest radio network in Hungary. We're just not going to give it away. Well, what happened is Fidesz decided, this is Viktor Orban, the famous Viktor Orban, who is still kind of a scourge, had basically orchestrated this, and he didn't want to take away our license because he didn't want to upset the Americans. So he had the socialists said, look, I'm taking over the country in 3 months, so if you want anything, you better go after the Americans. And we just thought it was a joke. To make a long story short, he just blew up the regulatory regime, took our license away. It became a major controversy.
Did they take over this network then?
Yeah, they took over the other one, and then the socialists took over ours, and then they immediately bankrupted them a few months later.
Did they pay you for it?
No.
What was all your equipment that you had purchased over there and the transmitters and everything?
Yeah. I mean, it was. And what's funny, a great story. Bill Kennard, who had been chairman of the FCC, had just been named ambassador to the European Union. Now, Hungary is technically a European Union country, and if you follow it today, it's still because of Orban, you still have all this crazy stuff. So I called Bill. I said, Bill, we're being nationalized. He said, Jeff, you can't be nationalized. I said, Bill, trust me, we're being nationalized. He said, Jeff, you don't understand. You're part of the European Union. They would be violating all the charters if you're nationalized. I said, Bill, I'm telling you we're being nationalized. And a week later, he calls me and said, Jeff, you're being nationalized. I said, no shit, Bill, I know that. And it was a big controversy. Mike Pence led the Indiana delegation. We had a resolution in Congress condemning it. All the embassies of all the major European countries condemned it. But this is a man who took up the country. What I didn't know, and it was funny because at the time I called Viktor Orban Putin without oil, kind of being facetious. What I didn't know until I read Bill Browder's book later was that Viktor Orban was really Vladimir Putin's first client. So all the things that Orban did had been sort of set in motion by Putin. Today it's relevant because if you know, Hungary is the only country in the European Union that's not actively supporting Ukraine. So anyway, that's...
but here's a guy from North Central High School that is flying over to Hungary to check out the morning show.
Yeah, well...
And you've got all these other things going on.
And I still remember, and I'm flying to Hungary to meet with the Prime Minister during all this. And the Prime Minister was a wonderful man. And I said, this is a crime. And he said, I know it's a crime, but I'm powerless. So he was the sitting Prime Minister with about a 30% preference. And before the elections 3 months later, Orban had already taken over the country. Strangest thing ever.
Did you guys make money during the 12 years?
A lot of money, and we won in a couple Hungarian courts. We won an international court, and then lost on a technicality. And
but it's an interesting lesson.
It is a great lesson. And
whatever business you're in, hey, if I'm going to a foreign country, I got to be really careful.
And I always say, look, you really haven't lived till you've been nationalized, and there are very few people you'll meet, Tom, who've ever been nationalized, and I'm one of them.
Wow. Jeff, I think it's a fun book. I really liked it. And again, even though I'm in radio, I don't do what you do. I'm not up here. But you guys get involved in a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about this is my assessment is you're a really good delegator.
Yeah.
And you would say, okay, he's handling this. However, you really kind of stuck your own thoughts into things like starting this sports network.
Yeah.
And the eventual hip hop station in L.A.
Yeah.
Just based on your love of radio and your own instinct, and it's you going against. I remember there's a scene where everyone's voting against you, and they finally I think you mentioned it earlier. He can do this. When we got another.
We feel sorry for him. Yeah.
I mean, so you had some really great ideas.
Some. And what I've learned, I have a couple feelings about business. Number one, I've never met a human being who goes into work in the morning and says, how do I screw my job up? So our job as managers is to give them the tools and let them do their work. We are a very collaborative culture. I'm very proud that to this day, people walk into my office and say, you know what, I think your idea is full of shit. And that's the culture I want. I want a collaborative culture. It's a non-dictatorial culture. It's very collaborative, and usually we'll go around the table, and whatever has the most votes wins. I've been involved. Somebody asked me the other day, how involved were you with baseball? And I said, look, I always let our people, when they asked me to weigh in, I weighed in. I talked about a trade we made, which I weighed in totally wrong on, when we were going to trade 3 pitchers for Kevin Mitchell. And we said, well, it seemed like a wise idea because Kevin Mitchell is a perfect cleanup hitter to hit behind Ken Griffey. Seems like a great idea. We've got a surplus of pitchers, so what the heck? It turned out Kevin Mitchell stopped hitting home runs when we traded for him. And the pitcher, but that's life. But I've always been able to give my opinions. But when you hire good people, let them do their job.
There's a bunch of great stories about Ken Griffey. There's great stories about Dave Letterman.
Yep.
And then the company gets real big.
Yep.
And then you divest of a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
What is Emmis doing now?
Emmis made the decision about 5 or 6 years ago to slowly disengage itself from the media business. We sold our magazines. We sold our stations. We have 2 radio stations left in New York that we will sell. We now have a dynamic pricing business, which we love, which basically finds the optimal price. We have a team of economists who build algorithms.
The price for what? For businesses?
Yeah, for basically, mostly attractions, zoos, aquariums, amusement parks, performing arts centers, just all sorts of things. And it's built a very nice business. It's growing nicely. We have a sound masking business, which controls the element of sound in offices and hospitals. Now, we love that business, although I said only I could buy a business that controls sound in offices and hospitals right before a pandemic, which pretty much closes up offices and limits the use of hospitals. But we like the business. Then we have a business that creates content for corporations with podcasting and other stuff. And we're looking for more things. We were fortunate, Tom. Most of my peers in the industry went bankrupt. We never did. At our peak, I think we had close to $2 billion of debt. We paid it all off. We have money in the bank. We have no debt. And I got a group of people who I dearly love who are really good at stuff, and we're just going to keep doing new stuff.
And I assume you're going to be like me. You're a little older than I am, but
yeah,
they're going to carry me out of a radio station on a gurney.
Yeah.
They won't be able to resuscitate me.
Yeah.
You're going to keep working because one of the things I get out of this book, you have had so much fun.
Right.
And like I said, you're, for the most part, really kind to even people that you're up against and don't agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, you come off as being a really nice guy, but you really had a good ride.
I've had a great ride. I will never retire. I love what I do. And I'm one of those people, like I said, I'm not employable in a free society. The people who have seen me play golf realize that is not going to happen on a regular basis. And I love what I do, and I look for challenges. I'd love to see Emmis grow to a different level and maybe be more of a benefactor to this community and other communities. But I love it, and I've been fortunate. I've been more fortunate than I could ever imagine.
And you talk about the building up and a lot of the successes, a bunch of great stories. And then you talk about there was a rough period there in which you had to kind of withdraw from being on the USC stuff and the donations and all that.
Yeah.
And you recover thanks to some great friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing that I get out of this book is you have so many good friends that have made a lot of money with you, lost a little bit, but came back and said, hey, he's having a rough year, let's help him out.
Yeah, and I have a saying, it's hard for givers to take and it's hard for takers to give. By the way, I'm well known as somebody who gives. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just who I am. So when I found personal financial problems, it was hard to go ask people. And it was incredibly gratifying when I did, when I needed help, and they gave it to me, and I was fortunate enough to pay it all back.
With interest.
With interest, absolutely right. One of my friends, who should remain nameless, who's all over the book, but he said, I don't know how to accept this money. Whenever I've done this in the past, nobody ever paid me back. And I laughed. But
I know what that's like.
Yeah, but I've had a few of those too. But I mean, it's just been fun. And I think the thing about being an entrepreneur is anybody who says I'm an entrepreneur and it was a straight right up is lying. And anybody who says I don't make any mistakes is lying. This is a book about what life is really like on the ups and downs, how you deal with the downs. The last line of the book, my mom's line, which in life you just got to laugh. And I think I've been blessed with her sense of humor, and I think that's been fun.
There's a story in the very beginning that I really loved, and I can't remember it. I'll let you tell it. You said that if you know someone of a specific background, they did one of two things. You know the story I'm talking about?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's so brilliant.
Well, it's funny. Being Jewish from the Midwest, you'll meet somebody and they say, "Oh, my family's from the Midwest. They're from Midland, Michigan. They're from, Sioux City, Iowa." And I always say, "Were they in scrap or dry goods?" And they go, "Dry goods or scrap." "How did you possibly know that?" I said, "Because every Jew who came to the Midwest was either in scrap or dry goods. They weren't exactly anything else."
There's a great Alan Sherman song.
Yeah.
Do you remember Alan Sherman?
Absolutely.
Hello, Mudda, hello, Father.
Absolutely. Here
There's
I am.
a great line, because I'm from Shaker Heights, Ohio.
So
There's a great line, and he goes, "For I am moving to Shaker Heights, where I have a connection in dry goods."
Honestly,
remember that line? I thought, oh, that's so funny.
But that was, my grandfather, came here in the late 1880s, and they were peddlers. They went around and they were dry goods and they were selling their wares, and the others were in scrap. They were not, most of them not in semiconductors or nuclear physics in those days. They were in scrap.
But you're drawing a parallel.
Yeah.
Without saying I'm drawing a parallel
Yeah.
here. You're just going into your background.
Yeah.
And then you slowly realize, oh, I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get engaged in so many different things, which we don't have time to talk about them all. But I think even someone who is going into dry goods
Yeah.
now would find this book fascinating.
I don't think you're going to find anybody in dry goods anymore.
You did get, what do they call it, a slug line? What do they call it when you write the
back.
Yeah, these things.
Yeah, those things.
Did you call Letterman? He's got a great one. You want to read it?
Yeah, well, I basically went to everybody. Somebody said, "Get the most famous people you know." And I think they said, "And Griswold won't do it, so get other people." And David, meeting, knowing, and working for Jeff Smulyan gave me the confidence to leave Indianapolis and seek fame and fortune in our sister city of Hollywood. I'll never be able to repay Jeff for his faith, kindness, and motivation. Please read this book and phone me. Anyone attempting to phone Mr. Letterman will be subject to prosecution.
Hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, and Andrew is my next door neighbor, Andrew Luck. Jerry Reinsdorf's been a big brother to me for 35 years, and I helped him write that one, which is Jeff Smulyan is the kindest person I've ever known, the funniest person I've ever known, and the smartest person I've ever known, except for every other person I've ever known.
That's
never
great.
write him. So it was just fun, and the Griffeys and Evan, so just been fun.
Yeah. And it's not a book that you have to be a radio person to enjoy.
No, I've learned, I think we're all the entrepreneurs of our own lives, and I think this might have lessons. The genesis of the book was taking my daughter to school. I drove my daughter to school every day from kindergarten to when she fired me, when she got her driver's license. And we just talked about life and the lessons I've learned and the stories. And one day she said, "Dad, you got to write this down." So I think it's hopefully people will laugh. There's a lot of funny stories, I hope.
Oh yeah.
But people will say, "You know what? I didn't think about this," and they'll learn a lot.
Well, good. I have one last question.
Fire away.
What if
Yep.
you found a stick
Yep.
on the outskirts of a big city?
Yep.
You're thinking, this is a pretty good deal.
Yep.
I know you're divesting yourself of all your
Right.
radio, but
Yeah.
if you had an opportunity like
Right.
that, wouldn't you go, God damn it, I love radio.
Yeah.
Hello, Rick. Let's do one more time. Would you do it?
No, I'd say I think Griswold will buy this from me at a markup. I don't, and I do love it. And Rick and I have had that discussion. As you could probably tell, we've been together at the first station almost 50 years together. We've had that discussion because there are probably going to be a lot of bargains. I think it's time for us to do other things. I don't know. It is
Because I know you love radio.
no doubt. I've always said nobody loves this business more than me. And I have another favorite saying in life: never say never. But my sense is that we would probably do other things.
Well, great. What a great pleasure.
Tom,
I really
love
liked
it.
your book.
Thank you.
I didn't know what it was going to be like going in, and again, I would call it a love story.
Thank you. And by the way, I have been a fan for a long time. Long time listener, first time guest. But you've meant a lot to this community.
And I actually, for quite some time, I actually worked for one or two of your stations.
Yes.
So,
Yep.
But while I was, I never had a chance to say hi because you were in Hungary. Where's Mr. Smulyan? Oh, he's trying to buy a baseball team. It's a lot of fun. I really recommend it.
Thanks, Tom.
And congratulations on getting it done, and stay alive for a long time. And if you buy another radio station, my lawyer's in the next room. We can probably cut a deal.
I think I know him. And I was laughing. Somebody said, "What do you think about selling the book?" I said, again, my grandfather started as a peddler, and I've come full circle. I'm now peddling books, which I never dreamed, but it's been fun.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Tom, thanks. Thank you. This is great.